I will ask you to take your seats. We are just finishing this cocktail, but thank you very much to all those who are here and come back, and I'm sure you will be very happy to be here because we have a great guest this afternoon. I'm Diego Mellado. I'm head of a division of the diplomatic service, the European Service of Foreign Affairs. It is a great pleasure to collaborate with the university. The panel we have organized for this afternoon has gathered different speakers with different backgrounds and experiences. I'm going first of all to present them, and then afterwards I will give them the floor to start the discussion.
Mikko Huotari, you are the executive director of the Mercator Institute of Chinese Studies, which is probably one of the most relevant, the best and most recognized institutes in Europe for Chinese studies. You've been there for a number of years. You're now the executive director, and you had several positions there. Despite your name, that sounds, you just told me that, please make sure that nobody thinks I'm a Japanese woman, but you're not either Finnish, but you have Finnish origin. However, you are a German expert from the University of Freiburg, but you also have very relevant experience in the University of San Diego and in China, universities of Nanjing and Shanghai. So you bring a very strong expertise on Asia, on China. Luego también es un placer tener aquí a Susana
Also a great pleasure to have among us Susana Malcorra, who has a sound experience in international relationship and multilateral relationship in the United Nations, and has worked with Ban Ki-moon, and also she has held a post in the food bank of the UN, and also she has participated in the peace actions of the UN. She's also very well known as a former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Argentina. You are at the moment currently at Madrid, and you are advisor for the Instituto de Empresas. It's a great pleasure. And last but not least, José Antonio Sanahuja. He is a director of the and chair of the Universidad Complutense. He is also the head of the Fundación Carolina, and she's part of the team of the High Representative for Latin America, and he's part of the team of Mr. Borrell. So with no further ado, I will give the floor to Mikko Huotari, and this afternoon this is going to be the less egocentric panel. We're going to talk about the rest of the world while we are in the middle of the war in Europe. What happens all throughout the world? It is important because, as Borrell said yesterday, Europe's future is going to take place outside our borders. Our future is going to be happening because of what is happening outside Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, and in the multilateral fora. So it is important to be able to understand and talk frankly with the rest of the world. So we will start with China, and Mikko uses the floor.
For the opportunity to speak here. I look forward to the conversation with this extraordinary panel. And I want to start with one observation which might seem trivial, but I find it quite important that we have to recognize how much strategic time and space are condensed at this very moment. While we discuss the Ukraine crisis, the next big crisis simmering on the horizon with the tensions over Taiwan, becoming much more prominent these days. You have colleagues, strategic observers in the Southeast Asian region who are contemplating the revival of a nuclear arms race in the region, etc. So I think it's extremely important to look at developments, as you said, beyond our immediate neighborhood and effectiveness. There's important questions, we could speculate about the role of China in the Ukraine war, about the approach of China to the global south, as it has been indicated with the topics of this session. But I want to focus on three questions, three strategic horizons of our European outlook that I find extremely important and where I see a lot of disagreement in our assessment. And I would like to start with the first one. What is the nature of the Chinese-Russian relationship? I think that's a key question we have to respond to. And we have two different camps. One basically argues now we should consider the China-Russia relationship as a single theater, one theater. That's a Washington perspective at the moment that you hear quite often. The other one is, which you also hear quite often, mind you, China is not Russia, so we need to treat them separately, differently, in different ways. Now, second big questions where we have similar disagreements is, are we witnessing a new world of geopolitical blocks emerging? Yes or no? And if so, how to position Europe in it? And quite clearly, there's a huge hesitance, I think, specifically in Germany, but other parts of the world, that this would not be in our interest. Now, the question is, can we prevent it, or what is our role in it? And the third big question that I want to pose here today is, what's our assessment of China's trajectory? Are we looking at peak China? That's a contemporary debate at the moment. Has China reached the maximum scope of its power projection, or are we looking at a China that is continuing in its ascendance to global power? And as I said, European assessments of these questions differ widely, and I think it's a core target and task for us to come to some approximation of what we really think is taking place here. Because depending on these responses, you will have different proposals how to position the European Union as a mediator, as someone who strengthens like-minded partnerships, as a beneficiary from the US-China tensions, as a moderator, equidistant, as a bystander, maybe as someone who is more or less silent and defensive. Now, I will not be able to resolve those points, but let me try to share a few thoughts on those three questions. First, what is the nature of the China-Russian relationship? Now, very clearly, ontologically, they're not the same. I mean, that doesn't require discussion. But I think we have to accept that as part of the Xi Jinping package of policies, internal and external, we have seen a continuous trend of growing alignment between Beijing and Moscow on quite a few core issues. So yes, I agree they're not the same, but in certain key respects they pose similar and linked challenges. Let me share a few observations here. First, the worldview of the leaders is quite similar in fundamental ways. They see the international system stacked against them. They have both very clearly explicated a historical mission to right the historical injustice that has been done to their countries. They both derive their international outlook on opposition against the United States. They clearly also draw lessons from behavior and patterns of international relations in the past years, specifically now the Ukraine crisis, that at the end of the day, the system can be used against them. So it confirms an instinct of paranoia and strengthens voices that are more nationalist, more statist, and more control fetishist than maybe in other parts of the world. So there is a fundamental alignment in the leadership outlook. It makes a difference that these two leaders have been sitting together for more than 200 hours and discussed matters of global affairs. What is maybe more important for us now is to look at the concrete and detailed trajectory of this relationship as it unfolds. And it's a very mixed picture. First, I mean, we have to recognize that we see strategic Chinese and Russian joint bomber patrols, for instance, in May 2020. That makes a difference. It shows you a certain level of alignment. Lavrov's support for China's position on Taiwan is quite explicit. China supports internally and globally Russian positions rhetorically, but also in terms of its propaganda at home. In terms of trade and energy relations, the Chinese leadership has made quite clear that they continue ordinary trade as much as possible, so they don't follow Western sanctions. But we also have to acknowledge that there has not been a transgression of certain boundaries. On the contrary, we have seen a decline with regard to certain strategic goods, specifically in the high-tech sector. So military support is our threshold under which we would measure Chinese alignment, probably most importantly. And so far, as much as we know, there has been relatively limited indications for systematic support by the Chinese side. On the contrary, what we see, though, is a rapid increase in, for instance, in semiconductors trade. And I find that important. So there is strategic support of the Chinese side, both with regard to finance, energy, and high-tech, which continues to be the case. So, what is the nature of the China-Russia relationship? It is a trajectory of continued alignment. Both sides see value in that relationship. It is a trajectory of continued and probably more expressed asymmetries in that relationship, where Russia will become even more of a junior partner in that relationship, which will mean it will have to make more compromises to satisfy Chinese interests. Second point, are we witnessing a new world of geopolitical plots? Well, I think there's quite a few actors who would like to wish away that this is to some extent happening. So I would like to distinguish between bloc building and bipolarity. We see very clear, hard material facts, both in the economic realm and in the security realm, where bipolarity is a trend and a fact. This is nothing that can be wished away. Plus, leaders across the world, specifically in Washington and also in Beijing, add a layer of systemic or ideological competition to that material world. Most importantly, it is how the Chinese leadership sees the world. The perceptions of Beijing's leaders matter fundamentally. For Beijing, as I said earlier, foreign policy is derived from that adversarial relationship with the United States, which also means that for European actors, we are seen as an instrument in that broader power struggle that is happening. Now, as a consequence, and that leads us maybe a little bit to the topic of China and the Global South, this arena of working with countries beyond the advanced economy set of G7, G20, etc., is something that they have been taking extremely seriously, and I think my colleagues will speak more about that. And it's not just the well-known Belt and Road Initiative that plays a role here. It's a systematic diplomatic, political and economic effort that has been ongoing for decades, and it's extremely effective in quite a few ways. And so the footprint is impressive. The linkages that are increasingly created with political and international institutions with security relations are underestimated. So we have to take seriously that China today has the ambition to shape global security development relations with its own initiatives, specifically building on that fundament of partnership in the Global South. Final point, and that will be a bit briefer. Where is China going? And you have quite a few interesting debates happening at the moment, where some see uncertainty in the Chinese system amounting to the extent that, another leader would take over, Li Keqiang, for instance, as the prime minister, would stay on and, go back to a more liberal course in politics. That's fundamentally wrong. And I think we have to be clear about that. Xi Jinping is here to stay, and the policies he stands for, i.e. more statist, more nationalist, less liberal, more control-focused, and more Russia-friendly, and more anti-American and anti-Western policies will stay. That's what Xi Jinping stands for. What we have to assess, however, is that we've probably never seen a period in the last 20 years where China was under so much pressure and internal turbulence as they are at the moment. So we don't know exactly whether China will continue to protect strengths to the extent as they do at the moment. What we do know, I think, is that in a period of global uncertainty and turbulence, China is preparing for a war of resilience. So they will shine better in a world where the competition is not about best performing, but the competition is about looking less bad. And in that world, I think China's leaders have quite a few assets and instruments at their disposal that they can deploy quite effectively. And so we have to prepare for a stronger China, one that is more in control of things maybe than elsewhere in the world. So thank you, and I look forward to the debate.
Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias, Mikko, por esta visión.
Thank you very much for this clear vision to the point on China, the context, and its relationship with the rest of the world. Susana, the rest of the world. Some talking about the global south. What is your opinion? Thank you, Diego. Thank you, José, and thank you to the organizers for having invited me. I prepared my notes in English, so I will talk in English if it's possible. It's going to be clear, and so if I may.
Uso el castellano. Ok. Esto me pone una presión adicional. Bueno, de nuevo, gracias, José. Y Mikko, I'm going to use Spanish. Primero que nada, reconocer el valor.
First of all, we have to acknowledge the value of this course. To talk about what's happening in Europe is of major importance, and to look at it from an ego and selfish viewpoint, as the one of my country, is also interesting. But I would only correct the title, because we talk about the birth of geopolitical Europe, but I would say rebirth of the geopolitical Europe, because Europe had a major impact on the geopolitics of the world, and the aim is to have Europe to rebirth in this geopolitical influence. The second matter I would put on the table is that the global south question is bothering me a lot. There is not such thing as the global south. It is a definition that is simplifying the description of utmost complex situation. And if I may, I'm using Spanish, if I may, I will explain, I will use the metaphor of tango. It is the Bible and the Bible and Califon. So this might lead us to false conclusions. So in the positioning of Europe, this rebirth of geopolitics, the first thing I would ask to Borrell is to be really cautious about this reinterpretation about the global south. Having said that, I'm going to talk about the global south because the title is there. So I will try to shed a light indicating precisely the different approaches of the different shapes adopted by the global south. First of all, I will say what seems quite obvious. It is within the context of the Ukrainian war. I will say something that we already know, but we often forget. The Ukrainian war is not a problem of Europe. It is a problem of the world. And if it's seen as a European problem, they will lose an opportunity for Europe to occupy a strategic position. I think it is difficult because the urgencies and difficulties of the war in the European states leads us to placing first the local But if we look at this notion seriously, we have to underline the impact of the Ukrainian war in Europe. But for that, I'm going to use information that come from the United Nations. I'm going to talk about multilateralism. And many have said that the United Nations have not been actively present in the Ukrainian war, and the limits of the UN are well known. The Security Council is blocked because the veto right that Russia has makes it very difficult to progress. But having said that, the United Nations have played a major role that have ended that have led to the agreement for opening the transportation of grain to Africa. In March, the group of the crisis response group was created, and this group has already released 3 reports. The last one dated the 3 of August, and the first report states the fact that the Ukrainian war was a world matter, a problem, and there were 3 interrelated matters that were leading to a perfect storm: the cost of food supply, the cost of energy supply, and the debt crisis or funding crisis. These 3 different elements already existed before the war, and they could lead us to a situation, to a dramatic situation. And we heard that there were 107 world economies that are exposed to one of those crises: 41 in Africa, 38 in Asia, and 28 in Latin America. And this has an impact on 1.7 thousand millions, and this entails a fact that is going to bring about an instability to the world that transcends the European perspective. So the first thing that was mentioned in this report is that we have 69 economies in the world, 1/3 of the members of the United Nations that have severe or major exposition to the crisis: the food crisis, the energy supply crisis, and the debt crisis. These 25 in Africa, 25 in Asia Pacific, and 19 on Latin America. And it has an impact on the 1.2 thousand millions of inhabitants. And the stability described by Mikko, and to the realities and differences in between Africa and China and the States, we have to add a long list of other concerns, instabilities, for example, as we saw in Sri Lanka, that are going to have a major impact on those democracies that are weaker and that are going to not receive the whole impact of the crisis. So we must think about the fact that if we acknowledge the concept of the global south, this war is going to have an enormous impact on this global south. And if Europe is wants to position itself geopolitically, has to acknowledge that and has to take measures to facilitate and to ease some of this crisis. And here we can talk about the funding by the IMF, and one of the questions that have been addressed in the G20. But have not really been discussed seriously.
In the meantime, I just want to touch upon the issue of China. I'm not an expert, the other colleagues are. China has a huge role in all of this, a role that's not associated to short-term tactics related to the war in Ukraine. If Europe is convinced, and it has to be so in this geopolitical repositioning, then we need to look at things with a longer time scale. And China's been doing that for many years now. If you look at this from the south, it's over 20 years now since China's been investing in the south. Why? Out of its own interest, because it needs raw materials from the south, but also these investments have a strategic meaning. It's their garnering support. They started using a model that I call the African model, because that was the first place where it made major investment, very much based on their demand of commodities, and that they needed commodities to boost their own economy, and those were to be found in Africa. It's almost a sort of a neo-colonial model, where not only was there a great deal of investment, but they did something which I call is a turnkey, and I'll tell you a personal story about that. I remember at the beginning of the 21st century, 2004, 2005, 2006, I went to the streets of Addis Aranoche, and I saw that they were building huge avenues, incredible Chinese investment, and they were Chinese that were working on these constructions. So not only did they make the investment, but they also exported workers. And I remember having spoken to this about this to Prime Minister Mendes, and I said quite clearly, of course, Ethiopia needs working opportunities. And he said, yes, but the thing is, we need infrastructure and we need employment as well, but we can't resolve both problems. So at least we're going to get the infrastructure out of that. Then Latin America comes along in second place, and that just goes to show how adaptable the Chinese are. And Latin America, because of China's needs for raw materials, rare earths, so China made investment in this region, but in Latin America their investment takes a different shape, mainly because Latin American countries wouldn't have allowed Chinese labor to be imported, but they adapted and they were very flexible. So whilst Europe and the US was completely distracted on other things, China was carrying on like this. So Europe and the US suddenly wake up to China's reality. For example, in South America, they have to recognize that there were reasons for being distracted for many years. And finally, the Belt and Road Initiative came about. And this gave a more institutional approach to everything that China was doing, and just goes to show China's strategic interest in the world, because it actually goes beyond this Belt and Road Initiative, goes beyond the global south, and in fact even it makes inroads into Europe. I was lucky enough to be present at the forum when in 2017 this initiative was formally announced, and I have to say that the impression was of a refounding of a multilateral system with funding tools. What I mean is that a lot of thought and a lot of investment going into this initiative. And I wanted to explain this because if you analyze the role of China, you can't look at it from the short-term perspective, but you have to look at it from this perspective. And when we want to recoup our space, we need to remember the need to invest and invest seriously. And more recently, in the case of China, everything that they have been doing with soft diplomacy, or a different kind of diplomacy, is of course related to the COVID vaccine, where they had a presence. And I ought to recognize that Europe came afterwards, but they were there at the beginning. And the narrative, and I know our High Representative always talks about the narrative, they handle that very well. So China has this place there, which is different depending upon where they are in the world. There's not one way of doing this, one magic recipe. And we need to remember that. Having said that, what happens from the EU's perspective, and with this I'll conclude to try to make sure I stick to my time. Firstly, I think that the EU has a major challenge ahead of it. This challenge that Mikko mentioned, the Chinese vision and the US vision. I think maybe Europe can become a mediator, or at least be able to get some intermediate position between these two major powers. This is the role that Europe is being called to play and should play. I think US and European interests, and I'm going to say something very obvious here, but needs to be said, are not 100% aligned. Especially, they're not 100% aligned regarding China and Chinese reality. Europe, therefore, needs to define very clearly how to articulate these three axes that it's defined its position regarding China. On the one hand, to be a partner. At the same time, they want to be competitors with China, but they're also a systemic rival. But it needs to be defined on European terms, not on US terms. I think this is the role that is key for Europe. And not only key for Europe, but I would actually add key for the world, because this confrontational black and white way of things actually doesn't define the world and doesn't define Europe. At least I say that. One final comment. From a very local, parochial Latin American view, Latin America is calling Europe to be more proactive. Europe abandoned Latin America a decade ago, left it to its own devices. And I'm not saying that Europe is responsible necessary for that. And as we say in my country, takes two to tango. We are also responsible for that. Our region has been unable to position itself with shared visions, but Europe actually just completely overlooked and turned a blind eye to Latin America. And now, recently, the Commission has been working harder on repositioning itself regarding Latin America, and that's really vital, because Latin America represents a significant critical mass when we talk about multilateral systems. In the multilateral systems and an intense association between Europe and Latin America can contribute to strengthening this multilateral system, and also to drive this multilateral system to places that are neither black nor white, that are more equidistant, that are more closer to the principles and values that Europe and Latin America in general terms share. So in short, we need Europe to be committed, Europe that understands the granularity of the global south, which isn't a global south per se, it's something more complex than that. And Europe needs to play a lot closer role with Latin America and solve outstanding issues, including Mercosur is one of them. There's a lot more to be spoken about, but perhaps we can talk about that when questions come around. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, ministra. Precisamente.
Much, Minister, you spoke about Latin America. There'll be questions and debate afterwards, but you left it there so that Professor Sanahuja can now intervene. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here with you and the other speakers. And I first want to talk about Latin America, and I'm going to try in a few minutes to describe the responses of the region to the Ukraine war, and I'll try to give you a few pointers, not necessarily very thorough pointers, but some of the implications from the Latin American viewpoint for Europe. And what's more, the European Union presidency will be held by Spain shortly. Just graphically, firstly, very obvious, Latin America hasn't aligned automatically with the US, with the EU or with the West, but has different positions. But for us in Europe, this is a global war. It's a time of systemic change. We've heard people talk about the end of an era, and many other people have spoken in those terms. The US, especially for Biden's presidency, the Ukraine war, and the response that we're seeing has had a sort of a theological struggle between democracy and tyranny, which isn't exactly how we see things, but actually, as I'll explain shortly, hasn't actually been very well received in Latin Americans' response to this crisis. Latin America considers this war as a European war, one more European war of other wars that have emerged since the end of the Cold War. It's seen as far off and against its interests, just as sort of an irritating factor. And well, it's just come about when the regions should be recovering post-pandemic. Don't forget that it's the region that suffered most during a pandemic, because sometimes the way things are read is how economic interests make that recovery more difficult. And in the region, they try to find people that are to blame, and they don't always blame Russia. We see that some people say that sanctions in Europe have actually forced inflation. And it's something similar to happens to me as what happens to Susana. They're all very different, diverse relations. And it's very difficult to talk about the region as a region per se. And what's more, this war has happened at a time in which Latin America is very fragmented, a great deal of political fragmentation in Latin America. That means that the region doesn't have agency to direct international affairs. In fact, since 2015, its main body of consultation, which is the CELAC, and the CELAC has been affected by this polarization. There have been years in which the different political cycles have been marked, different political, and recently more conservative, and there's been this sort of ignoring of international organizations, which had stopped working. And what replaced it, which is Prosur, hasn't really done very much, and nor have its backers given it the role of the ability to reach agreement, reach a pact in this region. And this is something that's in addition to the great heterogeneity of the region. And thirdly, The responses for overseas policies are normally conditioned by domestic infighting. This has happened, for example, in Spain in its attitude towards Ukraine war, and it's happened, of course, in Latin America. And that explains the different responses, especially when you look at the different political leaders and the different political parties of different leaders. And this is the way, and when we've written about that in reports, we've had to differentiate between three different levels of analysis, and the relation between these levels is complex. Firstly, at a political level in the region, what positions has been taken towards Ukraine depending upon internal debate, and then secondly, what leaders' positions have adopted, and thirdly, the professional diplomacy, their position when they've gone to multilateral bodies, because they don't normally all coincide, and nor are they aimed at the same public. And this is something that I tend to try to differentiate when I speak. And finally, I'd like to say a kind of a conclusion, which is that after many debates and a great deal of different leaders' positions, when it's been time to vote at UN, especially in the UN's General Assembly, the region has responded fairly consistently, predictably, unified and fairly predictable, and which is consistent with the principles that have been maintained by Latin American and overseas affairs, which are very important to be highlighted. And these are principles that were founded by Latin America. Latin America hasn't just been a role taker. Latin America has established a series of principles which have been questioned with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Having said that, some elements that are prominent in Latin America, especially in leftist sections, are there. The political view of Latin America, especially nationalist and leftist forces, are predominantly dominated by anti-imperialism, which is represented by the US. And this can explain the trend or the aspiration to have this multipolar world. This aspiration for a multipolar world means a world that isn't dominated by the US. That is a world in which the traditional dominance of the US is questioned. And this is something that's been very prominent in Latin America. This has meant that the region has meant that in some countries tend to accept Russia as a power that wants to recover its status. The arrival of Russia in rearmament processes in the US and rearming at a low cost many Latin American countries, and then the Chinese vaccination diplomacy. This has been some of the ways in which Russia has returned to the region and had its status as a major power recognized. And this also explains the broad acceptance in the region of the Russian narrative of surrounding the NATO. That is their legitimate response by Russia, because it was feeling surrounded by NATO, and the legitimate demands for security that the West hadn't responded to. Perhaps in this context, we ought to locate Alberto Fernandez's unfortunate journey to Moscow 2 weeks before the invasion. If he'd known there was going to be an invasion, he wouldn't have gone, but he offered Argentina as an entry point for Russia in Latin America. And also, a few days previously, Bolsonaro had also been to Moscow with a trade and an ideological agenda, because Bolsonarism and extreme right movement in Brazil has also been very close to Putin. The fact is that these positions have then, of course, mixed up with political debates and the center-right have been seen as a way of aligning with the US and condemning the Bolivarian positions in the case of Bolsonaro. But for the left, this is on many occasions is being considered as an uncomfortable invasion because it didn't respond to the typical libretto of US imperialism, which traditionally would invade countries. As I said earlier, there's this acceptance of Russia. Russia, when it uses this narrative that the NATO has provoked it by surrounding it, and that has legitimated at the end of the day its invasion. And this is, we've heard in spokesmen who have spoken, for example, from Bolivia, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and the Communist Party in Chile, for example. I remember reading recently, and this is just an anecdote, the fact that not so many years ago, the CGT of Argentina invited Alexander Dukin as one of its speakers to come and speak there. This explains the acceptance of this narrative of denazification and the surprising identification of Putinism as if it was a sort of a historical continuation of communism, at least in overseas policies. These difficulties, we've seen the difficulties of left-wing, we've seen in the Puebla group, who showed how you can infer a very active internal debate, but there's a common element that I'd like to highlight from in these ideological elements that I think is important for our conversation this afternoon, which is the generalized trend in Latin America to deny the EU independence and agency. The perception of the EU is that it has no agency and it's just a sort of a secondary player subject to what the US wants. And that's not true. We've actually seen now the unity and the agency that the EU is showing in this crisis. But I want to point this out because this is something that needs to be considered when we talk about the different narratives that exist out there. Also, the penetration of Russian media in the region, for example, Sputnik and Russia Today. These media are presented in Latin America of progressive, with a pretty big audience in progressive and leftist sectors. This is kind of a paradox when you think about it. And recently it was said that 50% of Russia Today in Spanish is concentrated in 3 countries, Mexico, Argentina, and Colombia. Food for thought there. So, what are the positions adopted by Latin America? Please allow me to classify them into 3 groups of countries, remembering what the leaders of these countries have said. Firstly, those that have condemned it outrightly, the invasion, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, have clearly condemned and have clearly aligned with the EU in condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A little afterwards, they were followed by Argentina and Uruguay, so perhaps they could be join that group. But this alignment has its limits. It needs to be highlighted, and that is sanctions. I'll talk a little bit later about why. Which is, we condemn the invasion, but we don't want sanctions. And in fact, there's been no alignment, at least to date, of Latin America. The only person that's spoken about sanctions so far is Boric. Boric says Chile could adopt sanctions supposedly as long as they've been adopted by, for example, other international forums such as the United Nations. This is related to Latin American diplomacy. Secondly, those that are keeping a sort of the defense sitting, shall we say, Mexico and Brazil. Their leaders have taken a sort of have their cake and eat it, appealing their pacifism of external overseas affairs so as not to damage their relationship with Russia and to not lose support in their countries. And that's come from both the left and from the ultra-right. We've seen some snubbing in the United Nations, for example, Bolsonaro, but it's not the same listening to different people who have condemned far more firmly. And then the pro-Russian countries, the third group, which simplifying is Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua and Venezuela, who have shown greater political proximity and which are mainly anti-US. However, none of them have voted to support Russia in the General Assembly. They abstained. Venezuela couldn't vote because it hadn't paid its fees to the UN. In the case of Venezuela, that hasn't prevented Maduro from actually approaching the US when the oil question came out. But of all of these different positions, in the end, when voting at the UN, more specifically, Latin American countries, have they condemned? Yes, they've condemned the invasion. They've taken similar positions to the ones that we've adopted in the EU. And this is related mainly to the diplomatic tradition and the normative approach to all of this, which in the past has shaped international law. The strong adherence of Latin American countries that goes beyond political viewpoints when you talk about overseas policy. And then, of course, the centrality of different professional diplomacies and chancellors, which is by no means something that goes against others. The US didn't intervene. And the second principle, the Bolivarian principle, which is that the frontiers that have been inherited from the colonial period should not be touched, should be immovable. And, of course, this is something that the ambassador of Kenya reminded Russia of in its Security Council, and said it from Africa, where its frontiers had actually been drawn by colonial powers. This is a Bolivarian principle. Thirdly, the nuclear proliferation. Latin America has been a pioneer in setting up nuclear weapons-free areas and a rejection of nuclear arms. Fourthly, a rejection of the use of force and the support of peaceful decisions, peaceful resolutions via international courts. This is something else that's been sort of historical. And finally, this actual rejection of using of force is a rejection of there being excessive power. And finally, the rejection of sanctions. If these sanctions haven't been taken in those bodies which the region feels legitimated to do so, which is includes, of course, the UN General Assembly. We need to consider all of this when we talk about the Latin American position. And what are the implications for this renewed dialogue that we want with Latin America? 4 of them. Firstly, we need a lot more political capital investment. Latin America needs to be on the agenda. You need to visit Latin America, promote fora amongst civil society, amongst academia. We need to dialogue more so as not to be just in these self-referential narratives and spirals. And then we need to think about the causes of the war, which actually more related to the authoritarian drift of Putin. the nationalism of Putin, something which Latin America understands very well, which is the reappearance of imperialism. As for sanctions, we should also insist that sanctions are not to blame, they're not the origin of Latin American problems, of the economy in Latin America. Sanctions are a legitimate response. In any case, these political responses are due to other things, but we haven't applied sanctions to oil, to food, so we can't blame the EU for that. And thirdly, we shouldn't, as the US does, make the response to this war as something that fits in with in this war of democracy against tyranny. This is something that the Europeans claim. What we want are the basic principles of international order that are very expensive in Latin America. And this is very expensive. For example, they don't use force, the rejection of threat and weapons of mass destruction. The final element that I think is very important in our dialogue with Latin America, and we need to insist, is to claim the agency and the independence of European Union.
We shouldn't be seen as subaltern actors. So if some countries want to get on board of the NATO, it is not because they have been obliged by the US. It is to deny the democratic values. And I think that's we have to insist in our dialogue with our Latin American friends. Thank you very much.
Sí, por supuesto. A ver, un micrófono, por favor. El micrófono.
Micro, please. Could you please bring the microphone? Can we have the micro? Can we have the mic? Yes, thank you. We're going to open the floor to the room. I don't know where the micro is.
O desde aquí arriba. Sí, ya está aquí el micrófono de todas maneras, ya llega.
A mí esta sesión me ha parecido
I found this session very interesting. I really have still a great hunger for more information about China, so I invite you to make questions about China. You have very well addressed the matter. China, Russia. Russia is a very small economic, from the economic point of view. It is 10 times smaller. What is going to be the repercussion for the European economy, the evolution of China? Germany, cheap Russian energy, and but large Chinese market. Energy is not that cheap anymore. What happens to the Chinese markets if we compare them with ours from the point of view of the imports and export? Mercator, I'm sure, knows a lot about that because you're following the evolution of the trade relationship with China closely, I guess. So what is going to happen to the European economy, most particularly to the German economy? And I've got another question. I would like you to talk about the interdependence between China and the United States during the Cold War. There was merely a relationship between Russia and the US, but currently the trade relations are huge between Russia and the US. China is the big banquet of the US, and the credit has been paid by China. There has been $1 trillion in China of American bonds, so they are not interested in losing. They don't want the rival to be destroyed. They just, what is the equilibrium? What is the balance of all that? We fight, but we don't really want to be victorious. Susana, I've loved your story about narratives and how in Latin America, in matters of vaccines in Russia and China, they have been the saviors. I would like to seize the opportunity to provide you with a certain number of data. It is a subject that concerns me deeply. At global level, if we talk about donations, if we see how many vaccines have been donated, if you sell them to someone which is rich and is going to pay, that is not really exceptional. It's only economic relation, but exploitations of donations at world level, the European Union, according to my data, has donated 475 million of doses. 475 million of doses. How many doses of vaccines have been given by Russia? Tell me. The European Union, 475 millions worldwide. As Susana has told us, I have received a message of our ambassador in Argentina. Argentina and Russia are the ones who have given the greatest number of vaccines. What are the vaccines donated by Russia? And Russia? I'm sorry, there's no microphone. Russia has donated 1.5 million of vaccines dose. China? And what about China? How many doses? How many vaccines? China, much more. 135 millions, half of what we have donated. But the narrative is that Russia and China are the ones who have most given and most donated. If we talk about exports, it's not the same to sell than to donate, but it is also important. It counts. The European Union has exported 1,700 million and Russia 7,000 million. So they should be awarded a marketing prize, because if I export 1,700 and you export 100,000 and you appear as the one who donates more. If we go to Latin America, according to my information, we have donated to Latin America 34 million of doses. Russia is not on the list. It has given so little that it is not on the list. And China has donated 9 million doses, 4 times less. So they also should be awarded a marketing award, because with those data, the feeling in Latin America is that those who have given and administrated the vaccines have been Russia and China. But with this information, we see is not true. We have a serious communication problem, because if I look at the exports data, we have exported 482 millions, China 300 millions, and Russia is not on the list. Worldwide, Russia has provided 1.7% of the vaccines worldwide, 1.7% of all the vaccines. So there is issue there, because we have administrated 40% of all the vaccines. You can say, well, the African people have not been vaccinated. Of course, we could do more, but there's still a huge issue of inequality because we have received the vaccine 2 or 3 times, and in Africa, 17% have been vaccinated. So I just say that we have exported 39.6% of the doses, and then we have China 32% and Russia 1.7%. So there is a major communication issue. Things are not as they are, things are as we perceive them. Things are not as they are, but more as people they think they are. And here I have to talk about the global south. In all the meetings I attend, they talk about the global south. It's trendy. Saudi Arabia says, I'm from the global south. If you trace a line from Mexico, you go to the Mediterranean, and you go to Himalaya mountains, excepting Australia and New Zealand. Everybody says that they are from the global south. A global south that it is too heterogeneous to exist, but it exists because it is mentioned by people. They Saudi Arabia is identified with this this global south, all Africa, and an important part of Latin America. What is the global south? It is the anti-imperialist feeling, anti-colonialist feeling that exists, that prevails, and that is emerging now with the issue of the vaccines, because African people say that they are not vaccinated, that vaccines should be global and distributed worldwide. And we at Brussels, we have said that everyone should have a vaccine, but it's not the case. So, exploited by the political leaders, has entailed this sensation. And post-pandemic geopolitics are going to be really marked by the impact of a collective that were the non-aligned. And when I find Russian and Latin American ministers, the personal relationship is different from the ones that we established with the European ministers. So there is also a dimension not only of values but also of interest. There are many countries that do not want to be Russia's enemy. Very much is at stake. They need the grain, we need energy, and when we talk about China, is quite the same. The global south is a term that is going to have an impact on our relationship. Of course, we have to make a mea culpa. We haven't invested enough in the political relationship with the global south, or with the component of the global south. With Latin America, you have been ambassador in Peru, and I've been in Latin America, and of course they say, well, I haven't seen you in ages, and we are trying to renew the deals with China, with Mexico and Chile, and last data. It is quite striking to see that the European companies have invested in Latin America, and more than in China and India and Japan and in Russia altogether. So if those figures are right, this is announced by Eurostat, we have bet much more on Latin America, much more on Japan and in India and Russia. How is it possible it has been a very, I'm not talking about trade, it's about investment. The political relationship is not at this level. It might be our fault. We might have been thinking that is not necessary, but it is necessary because in the Chinese market in Latin America is very much important. And so world we are facing is a world where the countries are not really the West, but are not neither China or Russia, and they want to exist as a group that have suffered in the past, that have are lagging behind, and this battle for the system and this systemic rivalry is there because the political economic system in China is different. A single party, the economy which is a mixture of public and private, is presented in the face of many countries as a recipe that is much better than the multi-party governments, and many people acknowledges that. And the great narrative battle is going to be the ones that what is the system that ensure the greatest political freedom, but also the greatest economic prosperity and shared well-being. So that's why I would like to insist on that. There's China, the global South, Latin America that are part of the global South. That is part of the global South. And how do you appreciate these projects? And what has done China in during these 40 last years? What has done China? Russia has never done such a thing. The development of China is incredible. How is China selling its product? Is they sell their products as well as they sell their vaccines? We are really not doing well. So thank you very much, Minister.
Muchas gracias, Ministro, por estas preguntas y también estos comentarios.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'm going to give the floor to the members of the panel. We're going to start a little later, so we might recover the time, and then after we will have more questions.
Thank you so much for these comments and also the question. Obviously, on your first question that you posed to me, how deeply are we entangled with China and what would be the impact of a significant political shock to that economic relationship, such as the Taiwan crisis? And the superficial answer is we are deeply entangled and the shock would be tremendous. But I think after that answer we have to start digging deeper into the precise dimensions of that. Yes, China is our biggest trade partner, but trade in goods only. It's not our biggest trade partner if you look at trade in services. So that's the first starting point. So then on a national basis, for national economies, 93% of European exports don't go to China. Now that's also important, right? 93% don't go to China. 7%, 7-8%, yes. So country by country, obviously it's extremely important, but we have to start from the perception Europe matters more than China, and the United States in terms of overall entanglement is still a much more important partner. So sometimes it's our perception also that matters more than that. Yes, there are deep dependencies on a company level, and specifically the German automotive industry, chemical industry are extremely exposed to China. Now, will that pose a fundamental threat to the health of the European economy when those companies will have to divest from China? Yes, probably to some extent, as it does at the moment. Is it a terrible shock that will not be survivable? No. Now, what is probably the biggest problem is strategic inputs, critical raw materials, and the supply chain ripple effects of such a crisis. And I think that's in many ways simply either so clear that we are fundamentally dependent on China at the moment, and it will take us 5, 10, 15, 20 years to reduce that dependence slowly, or we don't know the exact ripple effects for those supply chain stresses that we would be exposed in a Taiwan crisis, for instance. So we have those strategic vulnerabilities. I don't see them in the overall amount of trade as much as I see them in critical raw materials and probably the supply chain shocks. What I find maybe most important to your second question when you asked about basically implying, look, the relationship with the US and China is healthy, right? I mean, it continues to thrive. There's a deep economic entanglement. I agree, but at the same time, I think we should recognize it's changing quite dramatically. Both governments are making quite significant steps to reduce that entanglement. Now, that's not easy for both sides, but the flow of FDI from China to US is basically gone away. So what has happened 10 years ago is not the story of today. We see delisting financial investments by pension funds, etc. So the deep network of finance is a pretty thin waterway between the US and China these days. We see reserves that China has held in US dollars decline quite dramatically over the past 2 years, specifically in light of the Ukraine war. You see new developments that US outbound investment will be controlled by the US government. You see high-tech exports being restricted even more. So I think we are looking at a new paradigm of US-China relationship that underpins globalization. It will be a different type of relationship. So it's not a black and white situation. It's not decoupling means there is no economic relationship. But I think we are entering a gray zone where patchwork globalization is probably a good way to describe it. And the China-US relationship will be much different from what it is today, specifically with regard to emerging technologies. So the paradigm of US-China venture capital jointly developing the future of AI is not going to happen. The paradigm of semiconductor development being a joint development globally, where the US relies on Chinese inputs or vice versa, is not going to be the future. And that's a fundamental change, I think, in the way, maybe similar to what, energy relations do to our own dependencies. So things are changing. I agree, it's still an extremely important and, weighty relationship, but it will not be the same in the next 5 years.
Okay, thank you very much. Susana?
Bueno, es injusto estar expuesto a las preguntas del alto comisionado con tan poquito tiempo. Porque José,
it's really unfair to be exposed to the questions of Borrell in such little time. You have addressed a huge matter. I did not address this question in my introduction, but if I should talk about my deep concern about today's world is precisely if we are going to be able to demonstrate that democracy is going to be efficient. Efficient, that means to provide results to its citizens. And when we look at the evolution of the US, it is a paradigm of democracy. This concept of the capitalism and the liberal democracy together, and we see how much the gap has increased among the ones who have and the ones who don't have. In the 70s, the income has increased to 116. And now to buy a house is 200% of growth, and the access to university is even higher. 250 or 270. This clearly shows that one of the paradigms of the representation of the democracy in the post-war world hasn't achieved the delivery to the citizens. That they in the States first because we have more information about the US, and also because it is the clearest example of democracy. This is our major concern. And China, in that sense, is going to take the most of this hesitation, and this is present in many countries. So this is the background subject, and it would be the subject of another panel discussion. When you talk about the Global South, you are right. There is a huge amount of opportunities, and you have talked about many countries that locate themselves in the Global South, but they represent antagonic vision. So it is true that there is the notion saying the resentment saying that the South is going to uh, go ahead. When we talk about the world pandemic, for example, the response also has to be global, but I haven't seen that. So you are right. When I talk about the granularity of the Global South, it is important to address this resentment that prevails. I've mentioned the European Union. I know that no one talks about perception. Maybe China and Russia donated the vaccine, but it wasn't the question. It was a question of access to vaccines when the global north or the Western Bloc wanted to solve their own problems. So the narrative construction is closely related with the moment at a time. Your figures are right, and Europe was a leader both in donations but also in exports, but it came later. So when it came, the narrative was already sold, and this timing is important, and both China and Russia are managing this timing in the right way. So it's not to be, but to seem or to, but we could be spending hours talking about that. Thank you. Comment on the vaccine question. Beyond donations and sales, there has been a key issue of the European position facing the World WTO, World Trade Organization, and I've got a comment, and it is my interpretation. If you compare the European position with the U.S. Position, the U.S. Its timing is important, as we have just mentioned. It is U.S. Said they were supporting the elimination of the patent of the vaccines. We are the country that protects the most patents. But if I may, I have my interpretation. I believe that US was not willing to get rid of this patent. They knew that if they got rid of the patent was not the way of solving the problem, because there are many other questions, not only the patent of the vaccines, but also the syringes, but the transportation, etc. But there was a much more complex situation, and today we still negotiate, and there is still no solution. So U.S. Gained a lot of prestige with this declaration, but we have maintained ourselves in the position that we had to defend the rules of the game. But the rules are also important to, as we have done with the Pact of Stability and the excessive deficit clause. We are not questioning the WTO rules, but we wanted to have exceptions. But we got late, and I think as a European Union we have had a bad action in this respect, and all that coincides with the number of vaccines and the resolutions of the United Nations. The President of Mexico talked about that. So we could talk a lot about that, and we could analyze all the sequences of the vaccines diplomacy, but I think that what we have to do is a self-criticism on how we have managed this crisis beyond these donations data. We are the ones who have most donated, but we also have these other aspects. The position we adopted towards the WTO.
And I'd like to end by giving some empirical figure and also a suggestion. A couple of surveys have been carried out recently in Latin America with a pretty representative sample regarding how Latin American citizens regard Europe's in comparison to others. It was one of them was actually commissioned by the European's Foreign Affairs Service, and the other was carried out by Latino America and was published recently, the results, in the Neurosociedad review. I'm not going to give you all the data, but just a couple of data, because there are some positive sides to it. In many aspects, European Union is perceived positively in Latin America. The Europeans are considered as a normative agent and as the best partner and a world leader in aspects that are concerned to Latin American society. So if you asked who is the world leader in many of the foreign experts, for example, in the promotion of world peace, the humanitarian aid and defense of the environment, it's Europe. What about the other side? Who's the world leader in science, education, economic power, and technological development? China. And US is the world leader in fighting terrorism and military power. So US is seen as a security power, as a militarized power. China is regarded as a economic and technological power, and Europe is seen as a societal power, as it were. So the question we need to be asked ourselves is whether should we debate with the US the role of being a arms leader? No, maybe not. But maybe we should be thinking about fighting with China leadership, for example, in science, technology, and education. There are three aspects. So science, education, economic power, and above all, in technological development. Those are, for Latin Americans, the world's technological leader is China, and it streaks ahead.
Estamos en el tiempo de descuento.
We're in overtime now. We started late, and it's now time to give you the floor. So if you've got any questions, please use the microphone. There's 4 people with their hands in the air. Good afternoon. 2 very brief questions. The 90th University of the Wind brought the 4 former presidents, and Zapatero spoke about how the effects of the Ukraine war in Latin America. What about the position of Lula? Could Lula be an alternative power? I'd like to know what you think about this. And secondly, and especially, does China have a role to play regarding the role that Lula can play? And as for Latin America, I've got this feeling that Latin America is not going to renounce democracy's system, but the development model. This idea that if a country strives, it will become a good economic actor. China is it offering a different kind of development model? And in this kind of development model, does the state have a greater role when it intervenes in the economy? Do you think things may change there? Those are my questions. Thank you. There's more questions here and at the back of the room as well. There are a couple of colleagues. And can you actually introduce yourselves?
Mikko, if it's possible.
Yes, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Jeanette. I'm English and Spanish, so I'm very interested also in the Latin American situation, very interested. But I had, on this occasion, a question for Mikko about this Chinese-Russian relationship or partnership or whatever you'd like to call it. I think at the beginning of this war, we all had a moment of panic at the thought that maybe China could come in with Russia and help them out in this war. There is a relationship there. It's obviously a big brother, little brother relationship. Yeah? Big brother is obviously China, which over the last 4 decades has grown immensely, and Russia, on the other hand, has gone through a series of humilities. So the relationship between the two is very, very, very unequal. Yet, for some reason, and I was watching him, Xi Jinping had absolutely no doubt about saying, I'm not getting involved in this. Why? Is it because of the fear of the relationship with the United States? Is it because he didn't want to make it into a third world war? Or what could be the reason for this? Thank you.
Okay, muchas gracias. Tenemos 2 preguntas más. Hay una allí al fondo.
Thank you. There are 2 more questions, one at the back of the room. 2 questions. One on the left here, and then... Okay. Hello, my name is Laura, and I agree that all Europeans, and more specifically the Spaniards, want a presence in Latin America to put a lid on this idea that inflation is Europe's, is to blame for Europe. But you need to remember that Latin America is a long way for Europe. I don't know if it's wise to actually invest in Latin America than in Africa when you think about food security and other problems. There may be more immigration and more instability from Africa and East. Why should Europe spend more resources in Latin America? And how can they do that without that affecting investment in other areas? And then another comment regarding the idea of Global South. I've got friends that come from different countries in the Global South, and they think it's a white supremacy expression in the sense that they have this colonialist feeling attacked to it. I don't know how to explain it in Spanish. It's as if they think that first they were called the Third World, then they were called developing nations, and now they're called the Global South. And they find it a very offensive term. They're not proud of it.
Sí. Luque Echevarría, senador.
Luque Echevarría, I'm a senator. I'd like to ask the panelists whether they agree with the statement that in Chinese overseas relations to increase their influence via economy and trade, one of the basic principles which they maintain is this non-interference in internal affairs of those countries that it has relationships with. Do you agree with that statement? And if you do, to what extent do you think, in your opinion, how much weight does this principle have to understand the success, especially in terms of image of China around the world? Secondly, do you feel that EU, and this is a little bit complicated, I don't know if this is... Do you think the European Union should also follow the same principle, or do you think that it's unthinkable and even impossible? Yes, thank you. 2 people, 3 people to finish. I know there's a lot of interest, so please, please ask you to be brief. although we're going over time.
That's my question in English, if you don't mind. This morning we have talked about Putin's miscalculation about the EU's response to Russia's invasion in Ukraine and how unified and determined it actually was. And I was wondering, that would be a question to Mikko, if this has been perceived in a similar way in China, if that was unexpected, and how this has also affected China's approach in Taiwan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Vamos a terminar con aquellas dos preguntas.
We're going to end with two further questions. I know there's a great deal of interest, but please, there's somebody at the back of the room. A couple more questions.
Sí, delante, justo delante, exactamente, y luego ya al fondo.
Isabel Campos, I'm a scientist. I wanted to add to this discussion the question of cybersecurity and the World Trade Organization rules, because the war is not made only with tanks, right? With tanks and savagery, Putin destroyed in the first 3 days of the war our computing centers for particle physics in Ukraine, the first day of the war. But since then, we have been suffering attacks from companies that are dedicated to cyber attacks, companies that do hacking as a service, if you want to call it like that, and which are hosted by Russia, China, and North Korea. And I wanted to understand if the World Trade Organization is going to be able to impose any rule on this. Thank you.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Allí al fondo y luego terminamos aquí con la última.
Buenas tardes, soy Ricardo Fraguas.
I'm Ricardo Fraguas. Despite the data given by Mr. Sanahuja about the good perception of Europe in this service, I was very much struck by how Ms. Malcorra shared with all of us how this greatest paradigm of democracy is the US. We in Europe don't feel like that. There are many, many examples in Spanish democracy, and I think we feel that Argentina, if we measure democracy as an exercising of human rights and freedoms, which in the US is completely imperfect. If we think like you, if we were to think like you, we would think that democracy actually cannot prove that it is the best option for governments around the planet. Could you say anything about that? Okay. They will then come back to the panel shortly to close with the responses to all these questions. I want to ask a couple of brief questions. How long do you think a government such as the Chinese government is going to last with intellectual, technological development, but in an authoritarian state without democracy, or at least not without a Western democracy? And I'd like to ask you a question, which is a very specific one. What is the UN there for? Because this right to veto, which is completely imperfect, which shouldn't exist, because Russia shouldn't have the right to veto, because Russia was an aggressor country in the Second World War. On the 15th of September, it got the half of Poland, and then the Baltic republics, and so the way you read what Russia has, how Russia has developed is imperfect, and in England and France, very much to blame for what Hitler did. So I don't think they are entitled to the right to veto at all. With this, we've concluded the round of questions and comments, and I'd like now you to please refer to these questions and also conclude at the same time.
I'll try to answer three questions very briefly. First is, was Xi Jinping why is he not involved, or why is China not involved in that crisis? I would challenge the assumption that this is the case. I mean, first of all, 4th of February, you know, the joint statement that I think the High Representative has called a revisionist manifesto in the immediate proceedings of that crisis. There was a call immediately after the breakout of the war in the Ukraine between Xi Jinping and Putin, where at least the Russian side claims that Xi Jinping has signaled understanding of the situation. We also know very much about the domestic propaganda in China that is impressive in the way how it basically repeats Russian talking points. We know a lot about the work that China has done to basically, as other countries have, contradict the assumption that sanctions are the right way forward. The diplomatic offensive and the support for Russia in international sphere, SCO, BRICS, etc., is quite sophisticated. So, and the economic relationship, despite the turbulences and the downfall of trade figures, which we all experience with Russia, because it's simply not an interesting trading partner anymore, despite of the sanctions. So I think that all speaks for an assessment that China is indeed involved in that crisis. The second point, very briefly, did Xi Jinping miscalculate, or did the Chinese leadership miscalculate? Yes, very clearly. But it does not undermine, again, the assessment that the strategic perspective in Beijing is one that sees a long-term value in that relationship. They saw Putin winning a quick intervention much more rapidly, and they probably miscalculated also with regard to the international pushback and the sanctions regime. But does that take away their fundamental support and strategic outlook and alignment in worldview and opposing the United States? No. What are the implications for the Taiwan scenario? It's too big of a question that I think we can answer here, but my reasoning is that they are probably more careful with regard to the next military concrete steps and re-evaluating their capacity to withstand sanctions. They're working extremely intensively on their internal resilience with regard to any possible countermeasures that the West could take in a Taiwan scenario, and they're preparing much better, probably militarily, for what might be a possible crisis in the Taiwan Strait. Is there any role for the WTO in countering cyber attacks? I don't think so. That's the short answer. That's the reason why the US and China have tried for a long time, a few years ago, to come to a bilateral agreement. Some member states have tried to do the same with China. But China is probably the biggest cybersecurity threat that the world has ever seen, and we don't have measures at hand to deal with that, certainly not the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Susana, un comentario sobre todo lo que ha sido dicho aquí. Adelante.
One comment. There were all sorts of questions. I'm going to be quick. Lula. I think that Lula can play a very significant role if he wins the Brazilian elections for change in the Latin American dynamics. The fact that Brazil is more decided to participate in a global vision of the region may have a tremendous impact. We could talk about this, we could wax lyrical about this, but I think that may make a change. And the fact that Brazil is absent is a problem. It really is a problem. And I think there Lula may have a role to play. As for the Chinese development model and the implications that that has, obviously there are many countries that say, okay, human rights are all very good and fine and dandy, but human rights include economic rights. So it's very difficult to talk about political rights, social rights, individual rights, when basic needs aren't being covered. And I think this perhaps is a narrative, a very complex narrative, and you need to turn that on its head to say, no, it's not one without the other, but both are needed, and the ability of democracy to provide results. And comments about the fact that Latin America is a long way from Europe. I think that if you look strategically what Latin America represents and what it's not its proximity. Because if you're talking about proximity, China's a long way as well. I think you need to look at things strategically. And the alignment, this came out in the Latino Barometro, the alignment of certain principles that underlie Latin America. And I think if we can come together, if we can get Europe and Latin America to come together, that would have tremendous additional value in many multilateral atmospheres. I know that some people consider the Global South as an offensive expression, and there are many problems with this definition. And this idea of non-interference, this is a historical principle of China. And I think it's a principle that, to a certain extent, gives China a competitive edge in some of its bilateral relations. I think it's something that we need to look at closely, because one thing is the principle of non-interference, and the other thing is to wash your hands of issues when they reach a certain point. And we're going to end up talking about human rights and only seeing human rights from the viewpoint of economic rights, which is the only way China approaches this. I think the greatest paradigm of democracy, and I don't necessarily support this idea, we've had a democracy summit that was called by President Biden, because that's how US sees it. And I go inside, that's why I used the example of these figures from the 1970s to date, which just shows the lack of distribution of wealth in the US. And this is, for me, a key part of democracy. I probably didn't express myself correctly, but the US sees itself in this way, and many people in the world use democracy, use the US as its benchmark for democracy. And the final question was that of the veto. This is a great question. Why does this veto exist? The only reason in which the 5 major powers agree on is not changing the situation of veto. It's the only thing they agree on. Those 5 that have veto, have the right to veto. And this is something which is at the heart of the creation of the UN. It reflects a moment, an era, a balance of power, and the fact that the European Union wasn't present in the UN as a single entity. So there were many things that need to be changed in the structure and the basis of United Nations. For a start, it doesn't represent a distribution of power. But this is a key question, and the fact that it's a key question is because it's in the hands of those that have veto, and the only thing that they systematically agree on is the issue of a veto, interestingly enough. Yes, when you're ready. I'd like to add something to what's just been said, and I'm going to say this quite clearly. I think the fact that the UN is imperfect doesn't logically mean that the alternative is that it disappears. This is a common fallacy, and we need to fight against it. There's no point in throwing out the baby with the bathwater. What we cannot do is just say that these imperfections to make the UN disappear, because any alternative to this disappearance of these multilateral organizations is obviously a lot worse. So despite the imperfections, the world is what it is. There's a film that ends saying that nobody's perfect. So what we need to do is to work, especially considering those limits, to see how we can face up to these obvious lackings that exist. International organizations need to be asked to be effective, representative, and legitimate. And these 3 fields, UN has its problems, but the alternative to these is far worse. So that's the first thing I want to say. Secondly, there's a way of acting when one of the powers veto, which is the union peace. This has only been activated in history only twice, and somebody can correct me on this if they want to. One was in 1950 in the Korean War, and the second time was now with the attack on Ukraine, when the draft condemnation is presented and China and Russia veto it, then this process is activated. And thanks to that, we've got today a resolution of 144 countries, very few supporting Russia, some abstaining, and the majority have said in that resolution that what's happened there is not a conflict, is not a crisis. No, it's an act of aggression. An act of aggression which has been catalogued and which is described in the UN Charter and in and international law as an international crime. It's just a symbolic. But the fact that it's been classified as an act of aggression isn't just a free interpretation that somebody has made or some kind of academic hypothesis, but rather it's an agreement from the vast majority of the international community that has decided that this fact should be described and in this way. And this is something that the UN has done. And in addition to activating this, another resolution was approved which sets up a semi-automatic movement so that if this situation happens again, it will go directly to the General Assembly and you can avoid the veto in that way. And we need to know that. And that gives us a great deal of legitimacy that we wouldn't have otherwise. Having said that, I'd like to also respond to some things. Well, Lula, and here I'm talking with the freedom that we academics are given. The starting point for Bolsonaro as a regional leader, as a possible interlocutor with the EU, is so bad that it's difficult not to be improved upon. Even with the problems that have been announced, if Lula is elected, is going to be far less than regional agreement, regional pacts, and interlocution with the European Union. We want a summit with the European Union, CELAC, with the non-explicit, based on the non-existent premise that Lula is going to win those elections. What we know is that if this meeting hasn't been held, it's because Brazil has vetoed any meeting of CELAC if Venezuela is present. One of the lessons that we've learned from the Americas Summit is that the EU CELAC Summit needs to be inclusive, and there's going to be governments that we don't like, that we don't agree with, but nobody should be left out, because what we need to do is to sit down, talk, and face up to things. That's the approach. But for that to happen, Lula needs to win the elections. That doesn't mean to say that there's not going to be problems. In fact, we shared one of the Lula's declarations. That is that Europeans are now putting problems, France especially. We now have a resolution of the European Parliament that's been approved by the majority of the chamber to say that the Mercosur EU agreement cannot be ratified in its current state. A binding environmental commitment needs to be added because the EU doesn't want an agreement with Mercosur if the Bolsonaro kind of environmental policies are being followed. So yesterday, Lula said that if he wins the elections, he wants to reopen negotiation because he doesn't agree with public purchasing because it prevents Brazil from developing its own industrial policy. Because our development model is also changing. And this creates problems with association agreements, and we need to recognize that. So let's see what happens, but there's going to be difficulties, but there are also going to be tremendous advantages if Lula wins these elections to recover the political dialogue which is so necessary for Latin America.
When we ask if we can just give resources to Latin America when we have already many things to face or to attend, I admit this reasoning in one dimension, the official aid to development. It is the great array of instruments of the European Union is large, and we have many instruments that do not depend on the fact that we can put some resources on the table. We have diplomacy, we can do a lot with very few resources. We have investment instruments. One of the aspects we have difficulties to compete with China is the investment for infrastructure. Latin America has a great need of infrastructure, resilient and sustainable for its development. And they're not going to mobilize resources. Europeans, we are the major private investors, but we haven't had up to now an instrument to help the governments to have public infrastructures. But now, with this new instrument, Global Europe, we can mobilize investment resources for Latin America and other regions with a combination with the funds of the commissions and the public banks of development of all the member states. If we have a good architecture for the foreign investment, we can have a financial muscle to give attractive offer to Latin America, compete with China, and make an offer in this domain. And now we have instruments that we did not have in the past with Latin America, and we have them ready to be deployed. That's what we are going to address in the next summit. And when talking about democracy, here there is a key difference between the policy we have had regarding Latin America, for example, in the 80s when we have dictatorships or transition processes, or in the 90s when there was a deployment of consolidation process of democracy. What we had then, it was Latin America that wanted this aid to reinforce the democracies. But what we have to acknowledge is that democracy is a worldwide issue, and what we cannot do is to reduce the problem of democracy in Latin America to 3 countries. If Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, it doesn't mean that they are a problem for democracy, but there is an ease in that respect. We have the worst indicators with the satisfaction with democracy in the last 25 years, according to the last opinion polls. When we go to European Union, it is a bit the same. These polls are carried out with the Mori survey, so we have to compare the Latin American data. We compare them with the US and the EU. They're not very much different when we talk about the lack of satisfaction of citizens regarding democracy. We have seen images lately, for example, the ultra attack in the Capitol that was promoted by Trump. Blinken gave a discourse. Blinken said something quite basic. We also have problems. This is a shared problem, and the only way to carry out a dialogue on democracy is to do that in a logic of horizontality, in a logic where we assume that the problems we are facing are problems very widely spread, and that they are shared. And of course, we have to look at the verticality of the relationship. Thank you very much. There is a round of applause is for everybody and for all of you.
Vuestras contribuciones, o sea que muchísimas gracias de haber estado aquí.
Thank you very much. Thank you.